When we think about slavery in America, one of the darkest institutions in human history, certain images often come to mind. White male slaveholders exploiting black women. Families are being torn apart. The brutal violence of whips, chains, and forced labor. But what about the stories that were buried, deliberately hidden away? What about the abuse suffered by enslaved black men at the hands of white women? This is a part of history that has been silenced for centuries, and today we're going to confront it head-on. So if you believe history should be told in its entirety, not just the parts that make people comfortable, stay with me. For generations, scholars hesitated to even imagine that white women could be perpetrators of sexual violence. Why? Because society clung to deeply gendered assumptions. The idea that women were too delicate, too virtuous, too weak, physically and emotionally, to commit serious crimes, and certainly not sexual ones. And when it came to men, another damaging myth stood in the way. The belief that men cannot be victims of sexual abuse. Together, these ideas created silence. Silence in the archives, silence in scholarship, silence in the stories that were passed down. But history refuses to stay buried forever. Historians are now piecing together fragments of testimony, divorce petitions, travel journals, abolitionist reports, and even whispers from within the enslaved community itself. For example, in Virginia, between the late 1700s and mid-1800s, about 9% of divorce petitions involved accusations of interracial adultery. In many cases, white husbands accused their wives of pursuing relationships, or more accurately, coercive sexual contact with enslaved black men. A Danish traveler, Peter Nielsen, recorded in the 1820s that a planter's daughter had fallen in love with one of her father's slaves. She didn't wait for him to approach her, she seduced him. And then there's the chilling story recorded by Harriet Jacobs, herself an enslaved woman who became one of the most powerful voices of her time. In her autobiography, she tells of a man named Luke, chained to his bedridden master's side. Luke was forced to be available not just for labor, but for his master's sexual needs. And punishment for refusal came swiftly: whippings, humiliation, and worse. While Jacobs had to veil her language to avoid offending the sensibilities of 19th century readers, the truth between the lines is clear. We cannot think of this simply as affairs or relationships. That's a distortion. What we are seeing is the use of sex as a weapon of domination and control. As historian Thomas Foster argues, black men were subjected to every form of sexual exploitation, from outright assault to forced reproduction, to manipulative coercion, to psychological degradation. One white man, Louis Bourne, even filed for divorce in 1824 because his wife's obsession with a male slave named Edmund had gone so far that she refused to give him up. For the white woman, this kind of pursuit could serve multiple purposes. It was not only about domination over the enslaved man, it was also a way to defy and destabilize the authority of white men. A radical reversal of the gender hierarchy played out on the body of an enslaved man who had no power to resist. The abolitionist Captain Richard J. Hinton once said, "I have never found a bright-looking colored man whose confidence I have won who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled either by his mistress or by white women of the same class to have connection with them." One man confided to Hinton that after his master died, the mistress of the household ordered him to sleep with her. Refusal was not an option. These weren't isolated stories. They were part of a larger, unspoken reality. But let's zoom out for a moment, because to really understand this, we need to ask, how much power did white women actually have under slavery? The answer might surprise you. Take Martha Washington, wife of George Washington. When they married in 1759, George brought about 18 enslaved people into the household. Martha, she brought 84. Yes, the First Lady of the United States was one of the wealthiest slaveholders in the state of Virginia. Historian Stephanie E. Jones Rogers, in her groundbreaking book, They Were Her Property, shows that white women owned nearly 40% of enslaved people in some parts of the South. Parents often gave daughters enslaved people rather than land, making them more desirable marriage prospects. Far from being passive, white women actively bought, sold, punished, and profited from enslaved people. And they were taught from childhood how to do it. In Works Progress Administration interviews conducted with former slaves in the 1930s, many recalled how little white girls were encouraged, even required, to beat enslaved people as training in plantation management. As one enslaved woman remembered, it did not matter whether the child was large or small. They always beat you till the blood ran down. White women also exerted violent control over enslaved black women. They would force mothers to give up their own infants so that they could nurse white babies. They even placed advertisements searching for enslaved wet nurses, creating an entire market out of black women's bodies. Some white women complained that breastfeeding made them feel like slaves to their children, so they turned enslaved women into literal substitutes. And yes, in some cases, mistresses arranged or sanctioned sexual violence against the women they owned, or forced two enslaved people to copulate in hopes of producing more children, more labor, more profit. Even when slavery legally ended in 1865, the story didn't stop. Many white women clung desperately to the system that had given them power and wealth. Some hid enslaved people from Union troops. One woman, Martha Gibbs, even marched them all the way to Texas and forced them to keep working at gunpoint until 1866, a full year after the abolition. And later, during Reconstruction, some white women tried to revive slavery in everything but name. They imposed exploitative labor contracts. They wrote nostalgic novels like Gone with the Wind to recast slavery as benign, romantic, almost gentle. But the truth of what enslaved people endured, especially black men under the power of white women, was far from gentle. Why don't we hear about this more? Why is it absent from mainstream histories in classrooms? Because to admit it would shatter the carefully crafted image of white womanhood, pure, virtuous, fragile, innocent, the very opposite of a violent abuser. So these stories were buried. Enslaved men rarely dared to speak them aloud, because doing so could cost them their lives. And historians often overlook them, preferring to focus on male perpetrators. But silence is not the same as absence. If you look closely, if you listen, you can hear the voices of resistance, the whispered testimonies, the hidden truths that have survived despite every effort to erase them. Acknowledging this painful history is not about assigning blanket blame. It's about telling the truth. It's about honoring the experiences of the enslaved whose voices were silenced. It's also about challenging the myths we've inherited. Myths about race, gender, sexuality, and power. If we only tell half the story, we're not doing justice to history. And more importantly, we're not doing justice to the people who lived it. The abuse of black male slaves by white women is one of the most distressing and most overlooked aspects of slavery's dark history. By examining it, by daring to speak it, we break centuries of silence. And maybe, just maybe, we move one step closer to building a society that doesn't bury uncomfortable truths, but faces them. If this episode has opened your eyes, please share it. Let others know that history is never as simple as the myths we were taught. Until next time, thank you for listening.